Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where lost truths, ancient mysteries, and forbidden history collide. Let's question the past and uncover what was never meant to be found. Intricate, colorful paintings cover the walls of Egypt's deepest tombs. Yet their ceilings are completely free of soot. This absence of evidence for fire poses a fundamental question. How did ancient artisans see in the suffocating dark? When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds are drawn to the colossal and the iconic. The Great Pyramids of Giza standing against a desert sky, the enigmatic gaze of the Sphinx, or the golden mask of Tutankhamun. These are monuments built in the open air, bathed in the relentless Egyptian sun. Yet, some of Egypt's most breathtaking artistic achievements are hidden away from that sun, buried deep within the earth in the silent, suffocating darkness of the royal tombs. In the Valley of the Kings, a desolate, sun-scorched wadi on the west bank of the Nile, generations of pharaohs commissioned their eternal resting places. These were not simple graves but intricate, subterranean palaces for the afterlife, their walls covered from floor to ceiling with the vibrant tapestry of gods, goddesses, and sacred texts intended to guide the deceased on their perilous journey through the underworld. The artistry is staggering. We see scenes of judgment before Osiris, celestial charts mapping the heavens, and detailed hieroglyphic spells from the Book of the Dead. The colors, the brilliant lapis lazuli blues, the rich ochre reds, the stark mineral whites, and the deep carbon blacks remain astonishingly vivid after more than 3 millennia. These are not crude drawings but masterpieces of composition and execution, painted with meticulous precision in the most inaccessible of places. This incredible beauty, however, presents a profound and persistent paradox, a fundamental logistical problem that challenges our understanding of ancient Egyptian technology. Before any carving could be cut or any paint could be applied, the artisans first needed to solve the most basic of all problems. They needed light. And in the twisting, airless corridors deep beneath the Theban hills, the evidence for how they achieved this is, quite literally, nowhere to be seen. The first part of the paradox lies in the sheer architectural complexity and depth of the tombs themselves. These are not shallow pits or natural caves that might catch a stray sunbeam. They are sophisticated engineering projects, feats of quarrying driven deep into solid limestone bedrock. A prime example is the tomb of Seti I, known as KV-17, one of the longest, deepest, and most beautifully decorated tombs in the valley. Discovered by Giovanni Belzoni in 1817, it is a testament to the ambition of New Kingdom tomb builders. From its entrance, the tomb plunges more than 137 meters, 450 feet, into the earth. Its layout is a complex sequence of descending staircases, long sloping corridors, and a series of antechambers, culminating in a magnificent vaulted burial chamber. The journey into a tomb like Seti I's is a journey into absolute blackness. The entrance staircase immediately swallows the daylight. Each subsequent corridor takes you further from the world of the living, deeper into a realm of profound silence and still, cool air. The path is not straight. It turns and angles, designed to mimic the symbolic journey of the sun god Ra through the 12 hours of the night in the underworld, or do it. Some tombs even feature false burial chambers designed to thwart tomb robbers, and deep ritual shafts that plummet into the darkness. Every inch of these passages, from the first step to the final chamber, was painstakingly carved and then meticulously decorated. The artisans who worked here spent months, sometimes years, toiling hundreds of feet underground, in a labyrinth far beyond the reach of any natural light source. The very design of their workplace guaranteed total, impenetrable darkness. So, how did they illuminate these vast subterranean spaces to perform work that required such fine detail and a steady hand? This brings us to the second and most confounding aspect of the paradox, the sootless ceiling conundrum. The most obvious, common-sense answer to the lighting problem is fire. The ancient world was powered by it. The Egyptians were masters of simple lamps, small ceramic or stone bowls filled with animal fat or, more expensively sesame oil with a flax or reed wick. They also had torches, likely made from bundles of reeds bound together and soaked in fat. These would have provided a bright, flickering light, more than adequate for seeing. However, they all share one unavoidable, messy byproduct: smoke. Incomplete combustion from these simple fuel sources produces a thick, greasy black smoke that carries particles of carbon, or soot. In an enclosed, poorly ventilated space like a tomb corridor, the soot would have been thick, clinging to every available surface, especially the ceilings directly above the light source. Yet, when we examine the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the most stunning and consistent piece of physical evidence is what is not there. The ceilings are immaculately clean. There are no black smudges, no smoky discoloration, no greasy residue obscuring the delicate paintings. The famous astronomical ceiling in Seti I's burial chamber, with its brilliant depiction of constellations and deities against a deep blue background, is pristine. The rows of intricate hieroglyphs, the vibrant depictions of the sun god's journey, the detailed portraits of the pharaoh communing with the gods, all are free from the telltale signs of smoke damage. This absence of evidence is a powerful form of proof. It strongly suggests that open flame torches and simple oil lamps were not the primary source of light used for the delicate and final stages of decoration. Some have argued that the artisans may have cleaned the soot off the ceilings after the work was done. This idea, however, presents its own set of problems. The paint and plasterwork are incredibly delicate. The pigments were applied to a thin layer of plaster laid over the limestone, often using a tempera-like binder such as egg white or plant gum. Vigorously scrubbing or washing a ceiling to remove stubborn, greasy soot would have almost certainly damaged or completely destroyed the fragile paintings underneath. There is no archaeological evidence to suggest such a systematic, large-scale cleaning operation ever took place. Furthermore, the practical issue of air quality cannot be ignored. A team of workers using multiple torches or lamps in a deep, confined corridor would quickly deplete the available oxygen and fill the space with choking toxic smoke, making sustained, detailed work not only difficult but dangerous. The artisans of Deir el-Medina, the planned village where the tomb builders lived, were highly valued state employees. It seems unlikely their working conditions would have been so hazardous when the quality of their output was of paramount importance to the pharaoh's eternal life. The clean ceilings, therefore, remain a silent, powerful argument against the use of conventional fire. If not fire, then what? This leads to the third major conventional theory, and its significant flaws: the use of reflected sunlight. This hypothesis proposes a more elegant, smoke-free solution. It suggests the Egyptians set up a chain of workers holding a series of mirrors, likely made of highly polished copper or bronze. The first worker would stand at the tomb's sun-drenched entrance, angling his mirror to catch a beam of light and bounce it down the first corridor to a second worker, who would then reflect it further to a third, and so on, creating a relay of light that could theoretically penetrate the tomb's depths. On the surface, this idea seems ingenious and plausible. The Egyptians were certainly skilled metallurgists and understood the basic principles of reflection. However, when examined under the lens of practical physics and logistics, the mirror theory begins to fall apart. The first and most critical flaw is the problem of light loss. No mirror is perfectly efficient. Even a flawlessly polished bronze or copper mirror, a difficult standard to maintain, would absorb a significant portion of the light it reflects. Estimates range from 15% to as much as 50%. This loss is compounded at every single reflection. By the time a beam of light had been bounced off 5 or 6 mirrors, its intensity would have been dramatically reduced. After 10 or 12 reflections, which would be necessary to reach the inner chambers of a tomb like Seti I's, the resulting light would be little more than a dim, ambient glow, entirely insufficient for the meticulous painting of tiny, complex hieroglyphs. Modern experiments attempting to replicate this feat have confirmed this, struggling to illuminate anything beyond a short distance with usable focused light. The second flaw is the geometry of the tombs themselves. As mentioned, the tombs are not straight, simple tunnels. They feature steep staircases and sharp, right-angle turns. Navigating these angles with a reflected beam of light is a geometric nightmare. It would require incredibly precise, unwavering alignment from every single person in the chain, holding their mirrors perfectly steady for hours on end. The slightest movement would send the beam careening off into a wall. The diffused, scattered nature of the reflected light would also make it impossible to maintain a tight, focused beam over such distances. What might start as a bright spot of light at the entrance would become a weak, hazy patch of twilight by the time it reached the burial chamber. While mirrors were almost certainly used to illuminate the first few meters of a tomb's entranceway, where the corridor was still straight and the light loss minimal, the theory fails as a viable solution for the deep, winding, and complex inner sanctums. Thus, we are left with a fundamental paradox, a set of conflicting truths. The tombs exist, filled with artistic masterpieces created in places devoid of natural light. The most logical sources of artificial light torches and lamps are contradicted by the physical evidence of the soot-free ceilings. The next most plausible solution reflected sunlight is defeated by the laws of physics and the complex architecture of the tombs. The conventional explanations are insufficient. They failed to account for the reality of what we see with our own eyes. This persistent enigma has forced researchers and theorists to look beyond the accepted toolkit of ancient Egypt, to search for a lost technology or a forgotten method that could have generated clean, bright, and reliable light in the deepest darkness. The silent, beautifully decorated walls of the Valley of the Kings do not just tell stories of gods and pharaohs. They pose a profound question about the lost ingenuity of the people who created them. With the conventional methods of lighting fire and reflected sunlight failing to provide a satisfactory explanation for Egypt's perfectly illuminated, soot-free tombs, the investigation must turn from what is absent to what is present. The search for answers leads us away from the Valley of the Kings and northward down the Nile to one of the best-preserved temple complexes in all of Egypt, the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. This magnificent structure, largely built during the Ptolemaic period between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE, is a testament to the enduring power of Egyptian religious tradition, even under the rule of a Greek dynasty. Its grand hypostyle halls, with their massive columns topped by the face of the cow-eared goddess Hathor, were open to the public for festivals and worship. Its walls are covered with traditional scenes of pharaohs, in this case the Roman emperors acting as pharaohs, making offerings to the gods. On the surface, Dendera appears to be a stunning, but conventional example of late Egyptian temple architecture. However, hidden from the grand public spaces, deep beneath the temple's main floor, lies a series of narrow subterranean crypts. These were not public areas. Access to them was severely restricted, often through small, cleverly concealed passages. These crypts served as the temple's most sacred and secret vaults, secure storage for ritual objects, precious statues, and sacred texts. They were the Holy of Holies within the Holy of Holies, accessible only to the highest-ranking priests who knew the temple's innermost secrets. It is in one of these dark, silent, and forgotten crypts that we find a set of reliefs so bizarre, so anachronistic, that they have become a focal point for one of ancient Egypt's most heated debates. Carved into the limestone walls are images that, to a modern eye, do not appear to depict a myth, but a piece of technology. For those searching for a solution to the tomb lighting paradox, the Dendera reliefs seem to offer a shocking and explicit answer: a depiction of a giant, ancient light bulb. The significance of the location cannot be overstated. The decision to place these specific carvings in a hidden subterranean chamber, away from the eyes of the general populace, is itself a powerful statement. If these were common mythological scenes, why not display them proudly in the main halls alongside the countless other depictions of gods and creation? The secrecy of the crypts implies that the information contained within these reliefs was considered esoteric knowledge, a sacred secret reserved for a select priestly elite. This context immediately elevates the images from mere decoration to something far more profound. It frames them as a record of something powerful, something that was meant to be preserved but not widely understood. The very act of descending the narrow stone staircases into the cool, still air of the crypt feels like a journey into a hidden truth, a preparation for a revelation not intended for the uninitiated. Once inside the crypt, the eye is drawn to the central and most perplexing image. It is a large, elongated, pear-shaped object, carefully carved in raised relief. The object is clearly defined, with a smooth, swelling contour that narrows at one end. Within this large envelope, its form visible as if through a transparent material, is another object. A long, thin, undulating shape that stretches from one end of the envelope to the other. The official Egyptological identification of this inner shape is a snake. Its head is distinct at one end, and its body weaves a serpentine path through the length of the vessel. However, for anyone with a basic knowledge of early electrical science, the visual parallel is immediate and undeniable. The large, clear envelope perfectly resembles the glass bulb of an early electrical device, such as a Crookes tube or an incandescent lamp. The long, wavy snake in its form and position is a dead ringer for the filament or the electron stream that would glow within such a device. It is not just a vague similarity. It is a specific structural resemblance to the key components of a man-made light source. The carving shows the snake being born from a lotus flower at the base of the bulb. Its long body then extends across the interior space, with its tail touching the far, narrow end of the envelope. This direct connection, from a base element to a terminal point, further strengthens the filament analogy. In some versions of the relief at Dendra, the detail is even more pronounced, showing the snake's form as a distinct, energized beam within the container. It is a depiction of something contained, something activated, something happening inside a sealed vessel. The artist took great care to render the scene with clarity. They were not depicting a vague concept. They were illustrating a specific apparatus with distinct, interacting parts. The visual shock of seeing what looks like a diagram from a 19th century physics textbook, carved into the wall of an ancient Egyptian temple, is the heart of the Dendra mystery. It's a visual anachronism of the highest order, an out-of-place artifact not buried in the sand, but displayed in plain sight for those privileged enough to see it. The technological analogy does not end with the bulb and filament. The rest of the relief completes the picture, depicting what appears to be a fully functional system with a power source, a socket, and a connecting cable. The base of the entire apparatus, from which the filament snake emerges, is the aforementioned lotus flower. While a powerful symbol in its own right, in this context it serves as the physical base of the object, the point of origin for the energy within. It functions visually as a socket or a terminal, the interface between the bulb and its power supply. Extending downwards from this lotus flower socket is a long, thick stem that runs to the ground. This stem is depicted with the same clarity and intention as the other elements, looking for all the world like a thick cable or wire. It is the conduit, the element that connects the light-emitting object to its source of power. Its presence is critical to the technological interpretation, as it establishes a physical link between the components, turning them from a collection of symbolic objects into an interconnected, functional device. This cable connects the lotus flower to a distinct object on the ground, a large square-based pillar. This is the jet pillar, a famous Egyptian symbol. But in this relief, it is not shown merely as a background symbol. It is an active part of the apparatus. It is depicted as the foundation upon which the entire system is built, the source from which the cable draws its energy. The jet pillar is shown being supported by several figures, their arms raised as if stabilizing or operating the device. In some interpretations, the jet pillar is seen as a generator or a battery, its stacked parallel lines reminiscent of a voltaic pile. The entire scene, when viewed through this modern technological lens, is startlingly coherent. It depicts a power source, the jet pillar, connected by a cable, the lotus stem, to a socket, the lotus flower, which in turn energizes a filament, the snake, inside a sealed glass bulb to produce light. The figures surrounding the device are not just passive worshippers. They appear to be technicians or priests, operating a piece of sacred technology. What we are confronted with in the Dendra crypt is not just one strange image, but a series of reliefs depicting a complete and logical system. The components are all there, arranged in a way that mirrors with uncanny accuracy the design of early electrical lighting. This visual evidence offers a direct and revolutionary solution to the paradox of the sootless tombs. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians, or at least a secretive priestly caste, had access to a form of clean electrical illumination. It posits that the pristine state of the tomb paintings is not a mystery at all, but the logical result of using a technology that produced no smoke. This interpretation, of course, stands in stark, violent opposition to the mainstream historical consensus. It requires us to accept that a sophisticated understanding of electricity existed thousands of years before the experiments of Franklin, Volta, and Edison. While it seems fantastical, proponents of the theory argue that the images carved on the walls speak for themselves. The question then becomes one of interpretation. Are we seeing a faithful depiction of a lost technology, or are we simply projecting our own modern knowledge onto a complex and ancient mythological symbol? While the Dendra reliefs present a visually shocking and technologically coherent image to a modern observer, it is crucial to step back from our 21st century perspective and enter the symbolic world of the ancient Egyptians. For mainstream Egyptology, the Dendra light bulb theory is not just unlikely. It is a fundamental misreading of a rich and complex mythological narrative. Scholars argue that proponents of the ancient electricity theory are guilty of pareidolia, human tendency to see familiar patterns, like a face on the moon or a light bulb in a crypt, where none exist. They contend that every single element of the Dendra reliefs, which seems so technological to our eyes, has a well-established and deeply symbolic meaning within the vast lexicon of Egyptian religious art. To them, the reliefs are not a wiring diagram. They are a sophisticated and beautiful depiction of the very moment of creation. The deconstruction of the technological theory begins with its most prominent feature, the large, clear bulb. According to the mainstream interpretation, this is not a glass envelope. Instead, it represents the primordial space, the sacred bubble or cavern within the underworld, known as the Duat. In Egyptian cosmology before creation, there was only a dark, watery chaos called the Nun. The first moment of creation involved the emergence of a bubble of air, a defined space within this chaos, in which life could begin. This space was often depicted as a protective enclosure, a womb for the nascent universe. The pear-like shape seen in the relief, known as a Shemsu symbol, is a known hieroglyph representing a following or a retinue. But in this cosmological context, it represents the sacred enclosure in which the sun god would be reborn each morning after his perilous journey through the night. The transparency of the object doesn't imply glass. It symbolizes a non-physical, divine space, allowing the viewer to see the sacred events unfolding within. This interpretation is supported by countless other texts and images from throughout Egyptian history that describe the underworld as a series of caverns and spaces through which divine beings travel. With the bulb re-identified as a cosmic womb, the filament inside it also takes on a completely different identity. The undulating shape is indeed a snake, but not an electrical filament. It is a powerful and primary deity, the god Harsamtis, whose name means Horus, the uniters of the two lands. Harsamtis was a creator god, a primordial form of Horus who was intimately linked with the moment of sunrise and the birth of new life. In Egyptian iconography, the snake was a potent and multifaceted symbol. It could represent chaos and danger, as in the serpent Apophis who threatened the sun god's journey. But it could also represent protection, royalty, the uraeus on the pharaoh's crown, and most importantly, primal creative energy. The emergence of a serpent from a lotus flower is one of the most classic and enduring motifs of Egyptian creation mythology. It symbolizes the first moment of life and order arising from the primeval waters of chaos. The snake, Harsantis, represents the raw, divine energy of creation being born into the newly formed space of the cosmos. Its sinuous, wavy form does not represent an electrical current, but the vibrant, writhing, untamed energy of life itself. This mythological interpretation is powerfully reinforced by the presence of the lotus flower. The lotus, which closes its petals at night and sinks underwater, only to re-emerge and bloom again in the morning sun, was the ultimate Egyptian symbol of creation, rebirth, and the rising sun. It was the first flower, from which the sun god himself was said to have been born at the dawn of time. In the Dendra relief, the lotus flower is not a socket or a technical component. It is the mythological source of creation. The image of the serpent Harsantis emerging from the lotus is a classic theological statement. From the flower of rebirth comes the divine energy of creation. This motif is not unique to Dendra. It appears in various forms on papyri, tomb walls, and temple reliefs spanning thousands of years of Egyptian history. To an ancient Egyptian priest, seeing this image would not have sparked thoughts of technology, but would have been an immediate and familiar reference to the sacred story of the world's origin. The cable extending downwards from the lotus is simply the flower stem, grounding the cosmic event and connecting the divine act of creation to the earthly realm. Perhaps the most definitive piece of evidence against the electrical interpretation is the object identified as the power source, or generator, the Djed pillar. This is arguably the most misinterpreted element in the entire relief. The Djed is one of the oldest, most common, and most sacred symbols in all of Egyptian religion, with a history stretching back to the Old Kingdom, more than 2 millennia before the Dendra temple was built. It is universally recognized by Egyptologists as representing the mythological backbone of the god Osiris. Osiris was the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and fertility. According to myth, he was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set. His spine, the Djed pillar, came to symbolize stability, endurance, strength, and above all, the promise of resurrection. The ritual raising of the Djed was one of the most important religious ceremonies of the year, symbolizing the triumph of Osiris over death and the restoration of order and stability to the world. In the context of the Dendra relief, the Djed pillar is not a battery or a generator. It is the symbolic foundation of stability upon which the act of creation takes place. Its presence provides the divine power of resurrection and endurance that allows the sun god, in the form of Harsantis, to be reborn from the lotus each day. The figures supporting it are not technicians. They are participants in a sacred ritual, symbolically raising the Djed to ensure the cosmic cycle continues. The presence of a knife-wielding figure nearby further reinforces the mythological context, likely representing a protective deity warding off the forces of chaos, like Apophis, that might threaten the sacred birth. The entire composition is a dense, multi-layered theological diagram. It reads not as generator powers filament inside bulb, but as upon the stability and regenerative power of Osiris, the Djed. The divine creative energy of Horus, the serpent Harsantis, is born from the flower of rebirth, the lotus, within the sacred space of the cosmos, the bubble. Furthermore, the surrounding hieroglyphic texts, which are often ignored by proponents of the electrical theory, explicitly describe the scene in mythological terms. The inscriptions identify the figures and symbols, referring to the gods by name and describing the theological significance of their actions. They speak of the rising of Harsantis, of the glory of the lotus, and of the power of the Djed. There is no mention of light, glass, electricity, or any technical process. The ancient Egyptians themselves labeled the diagram, and their labels are unambiguously religious and mythological. To ignore the accompanying text is to strip the image of its intended context, forcing a modern interpretation onto an ancient narrative that has its own clear explanation. The scholarly consensus is that the Dendera light bulb is a classic case of seeing what we want to see, projecting our own technological achievements onto a culture whose brilliance lay in a different domain, that of symbolism, mythology, and religious art. They argue that every single component of the relief has a clear, well-documented, and non-technological meaning within the Egyptian symbolic system. The scene is not a record of lost hardware. It is a profound and complex visual prayer, a celebration of the eternal cycle of creation, death, and rebirth that was the very foundation of Egyptian civilization. By regrounding the reliefs in their proper mythological and religious context, Egyptologists present a powerful and cohesive argument that effectively dismantles the theory of ancient electricity, leaving the original paradox of the sootless tombs standing, as mysterious and unanswered as ever. Even if we accept the orthodox Egyptological interpretation that the Dendera reliefs are a purely symbolic depiction of a creation myth, and not a schematic for an electrical device, we are left in a deeply unsatisfying position. Dismissing the light bulb theory with a conclusive mythological explanation feels like an intellectual tidying up, but it does absolutely nothing to solve the fundamental physical problem that started the inquiry. The ceilings of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings remain immaculately, stubbornly, and inexplicably clean. The paradox of the sootless ceilings is a fact of materials science, not a matter of symbolic interpretation. While the Dendera reliefs can be explained away, the pristine paint and plaster of the tombs cannot. This forces us back to the original question, but now from a more challenging perspective. If the Egyptians did not have electricity, yet the evidence for conventional fire is absent, what other paths of investigation are left? The mystery of the tomb lighting persists, and it exists within a broader context of other tantalizing hints that suggest the knowledge and capabilities of ancient cultures may have been far greater than we currently assume. The first and most direct consequence of rejecting the Dendera light bulb is that we are forced to reconsider or search for alternative lighting technologies that fit the known constraints, bright enough for detailed work, and burning with little to no smoke. One long-standing but controversial theory is the use of a special high-quality lamp oil that burned almost perfectly cleanly. This hypothesis suggests that the priests and artisans had access to a refined fuel, perhaps a specially processed type of castor oil or another plant-based oil, that when burned with a specific type of wick, perhaps made of salt-treated papyrus or flax, produced a flame with minimal soot. The salt, in theory, would absorb the carbon particles before they could become airborne smoke. This idea is plausible on the surface. The Egyptians were brilliant practical chemists, masters of creating cosmetics, medicines, and pigments. It is not a huge leap to imagine them experimenting with fuels. However, this theory runs into significant problems. First, there is no direct archaeological or textual evidence for the production or use of such a smokeless oil. While recipes for various oils and unguents exist, none are described as having this specific property. Second, the physics of combustion make a truly smokeless flame from an organic fuel source extremely difficult to achieve, especially with the simple lamp technology available at the time. A clean burn requires a perfect fuel-to-air ratio, something modern Bunsen burners are designed to do, but ancient saucer lamps are not. Even if a cleaner burning oil existed, producing it in the vast quantities needed to illuminate an entire tomb for months or years of work would have been a massive industrial undertaking, yet no record of such an industry exists. The salt wick theory has also been tested experimentally with mixed results, generally failing to eliminate soot to the degree seen in the tombs. The smokeless oil theory, while not impossible, remains speculative and unsubstantiated. It is an attempt to solve the mystery within the known technological framework, but it requires us to assume the existence of a lost chemical recipe that seems to defy the basic principles of combustion. This lack of a satisfactory conventional explanation compels us to look at the problem in a wider context, and this is where the mystery deepens. The question of Egyptian lighting does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of a larger pattern of out-of-place artifacts and knowledge found across the ancient world, suggesting that our timeline of technological development might be incomplete. The most famous parallel, though from a different culture, is the so-called Baghdad Battery. Discovered in the 1930s in modern-day Iraq, in an area that was once part of the Parthian Empire, roughly 250 BCE to 224 CE. This artifact consists of a simple terracotta pot containing a copper cylinder, which in turn encases an iron rod. When filled with an acidic electrolyte, such as vinegar or grape juice, this device is capable of generating a small but steady electrical current of about 1.5 to 2 volts. While most mainstream archaeologists believe these objects were used for electroplating jewelry with a thin layer of gold or silver, a sophisticated process in its own right, the fact remains that they are, undeniably, simple galvanic cells. They are batteries. The existence of the Baghdad Battery proves unequivocally that ancient cultures in the Near East, contemporaneous with the Ptolemaic period when the Dendra temple was built, were not only aware of electrochemical principles but were actively experimenting with them. This is not a fringe theory. It is a demonstrable scientific fact. The artifact sits in a museum, a tangible piece of evidence that the fundamental concept of generating an electrical current was not alien to the ancient world. While there is a vast gulf between creating a 1.5-volt current in a small pot and engineering a high-voltage system to illuminate a tomb, the Baghdad Battery serves as a powerful proof of concept. It cracks open the door to the possibility that knowledge of electricity may have been more widespread, and perhaps more advanced, than the historical record currently admits. It shows us that our ancestors were experimenting with forces we once thought they could not have possibly understood. This brings us back to the artisans themselves, the silent, anonymous figures whose incredible skill is the very source of this enigma. We often think of technology in terms of artifacts and machines, but the greatest technology of any civilization is its organized human skill. The men who decorated the royal tombs were not just talented painters. They were part of a highly organized, state-sponsored workforce. They were masters of their craft, capable of executing flawless designs in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The precision of the hieroglyphs, the straightness of the carved lines, the consistency of the figures from one end of a tomb to the other all speak to a level of professionalism and technical support that is still breathtaking. How was this quality control maintained in what we assume was near total darkness? How were the master plans transferred from papyrus scrolls to massive tomb walls with such accuracy? How did they mix their paints to be perfectly consistent in hue from one chamber to the next? These are not questions of myth or symbolism. They are questions of project management, of applied science and human engineering. The sheer quality of their work implies they had a solution to the lighting problem that was not just adequate but excellent. They must have had a light source that was bright, steady, and reliable, allowing them to work for hours on end with precision. A dim, flickering, or constantly moving light source like that from a relay of mirrors is simply not conducive to this level of artistic perfection. The undeniable skill of the artisans, therefore, becomes a form of evidence in itself. Their work is a silent testament to a lost method. The perfect execution we see on the walls is the product of a perfect lighting system we cannot find. In the end, we are left staring into the same darkness as the ancient Egyptians, but a darkness filled with questions rather than answers. The rejection of the Dendra reliefs as a technological diagram, while likely correct from a symbolic standpoint, leaves the central physical paradox entirely unresolved. The conventional alternative smokeless oil or elaborate mirror systems are fraught with practical and scientific inconsistencies that make them unconvincing as complete solutions. The existence of artifacts like the Baghdad Battery reminds us not to be too confident in our assumptions about the limits of ancient knowledge. And the flawless art of the tombs themselves serves as the ultimate silent witness, testifying to a level of technical mastery that continues to defy our explanations. The debate may have shifted away from interpreting a single controversial relief, but the core mystery remains. The true ingenuity of the ancient Egyptian artisans, and the method by which they banished the darkness to create their eternal masterpieces, remains one of history's most profound and compelling secrets, hidden in plain sight. While the Dendra reliefs may forever be debated as myth versus technology, the clean ceilings of the tombs are a physical fact. The true ingenuity of the ancient Egyptian artisan still holds secrets we have yet to fully illuminate. In 1961, a forgotten 450-page manuscript was found in a Romanian archive. Buried within its pages were detailed schematics for a 3-stage rocket, complete with delta-shaped fins, concepts believed to have been invented 400 years later. The year is 1961. The world is captivated by a new and dramatic arena of conflict and exploration: the cosmos. The Cold War has pushed its rivalry into the heavens, initiating the space race. In April of that year, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human to orbit the Earth, a stunning achievement that sends shockwaves through the Western world. The United States, determined to catch up and surpass its rival, is pouring immense resources into its own burgeoning space program. The language of this new era is one of rocketry, liquid-fueled engines, escape velocities, orbital mechanics, and the complex engineering of multi-stage launch vehicles. These concepts feel futuristic, the very definition of cutting-edge 20th-century science. It is in this exact climate of intense technological competition and forward-looking ambition that a discovery is made, not in a high-tech laboratory or a wind tunnel, but in the dusty, silent archives of a medieval city in the heart of Romania. This discovery would present a profound and unsettling paradox, suggesting that the fundamental principles of modern rocketry were not born in the 20th century, but had been meticulously documented over 400 years earlier. The story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a page. Doru Tătărescu, a professor of science and technology at the University of Bucharest, was conducting research in the Public Records Archive of Sibiu, a historic city in Transylvania. Sibiu, known in German as Hermannstadt, has a rich and layered history, having been a major cultural and economic center for Transylvanian Saxons since the Middle Ages. Its archives are a treasure trove of documents, a repository of centuries of civic life, commerce, and conflict. While sifting through these records, Tătărescu came across a thick, bound volume, a miscellaneous manuscript catalogued under the unassuming designation Varia 2374. It was a hefty collection, some 450 pages in length, written primarily in a formal 16th-century German script. At first glance, the manuscript appeared to be a fairly standard document of its time. The 16th century was an age of intense military innovation, driven by the proliferation of gunpowder. The old world of castles and knights was giving way to a new era of cannons and firearms. Military engineers were highly valued figures, and their treatises on artillery, ballistics, and fortification were crucial texts for any kingdom hoping to survive. The Sibiu manuscript, as it would come to be known, seemed to fit this mold perfectly. Its initial pages were filled with detailed discussions and technical drawings of cannons, arquebus, and various other instruments of war. It was a practical manual, a compendium of military engineering knowledge, covering topics from the proper mixing of gunpowder to the calculation of trajectories for cannonballs. For a historian, it was a valuable, if not entirely unique, find. But as Professor Tătărescu delved deeper into the manuscript, the content began to shift. Buried within the dense sections on conventional artillery, he started to find something entirely different, something completely out of place for the 1500s. The text transitioned from cannons to rocketry. This in itself was not unprecedented. Simple, single-stage rockets, essentially enlarged fireworks, had been known and used for centuries, primarily in Asia and later in Europe, for both celebratory displays and as minor incendiary weapons in warfare. They were notoriously inaccurate and relatively low-powered. more of a psychological weapon than a truly effective projectile. The rockets described in the Cebu manuscript, however, were of a different order entirely. As Tadarishu turned the pages, he was confronted with a series of meticulous, hand-drawn technical diagrams and accompanying descriptions that seemed to defy their historical context. These were not crude firework-like rockets. The schematics laid out with remarkable clarity and engineering precision the concept of a multi-stage launch vehicle. One drawing, for instance, showed a large, powerful main rocket body. Attached to its top was a second, smaller rocket. Capping the second rocket was a pointed third stage, the final payload. The text described how the first stage would fire, propelling the entire assembly upwards. When its fuel was exhausted, it would fall away, and the second stage would ignite, carrying the payload to an even greater altitude and velocity. Finally, the second stage would detach, and the third stage would continue on its path. This was the fundamental principle of staging, the very technique that the Soviet Vostok and American Mercury Redstone rockets were using in 1961 to put humans into space. Yet here it was, laid out on paper in the mid-16th century. The revelations did not stop there. The designs displayed a surprising sophistication in aerodynamics and propulsion. The author experimented with different shapes for his rockets, but the most advanced drawings featured distinct, delta-shaped, triangular stabilization fins at the base of the launch vehicle. While simpler fin designs had been used on arrows for millennia, the specific triangular shape of the delta wing is a highly efficient design for stabilizing projectiles at high speeds, a feature that would not be seriously studied and adopted until the development of supersonic aircraft and guided missiles in the 20th century. To find it on a 16th century drawing was baffling. The manuscript also went into painstaking detail about fuel. The author described various chemical compositions for gunpowder, experimenting with different ratios of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal to achieve a more potent and consistent burn rate. More astonishingly, he theorized about and sketched designs for combining different types of fuel. He described a method where the solid propellant core could be designed in specific geometric shapes, such as a hexagon, to control the burn surface area and thus regulate the rockets through an advanced concept known today as propellant grain design. He even appears to have considered a rudimentary form of liquid propulsion, describing a method for introducing a liquid fuel into the combustion chamber. The level of detailed, systematic, and innovative thought was far beyond the simple point-and-shoot mentality of early rocketry. This was not the work of a firework maker. It was the work of a rocket scientist. The discovery of the Cebu manuscript in 1961 created an immediate and profound historical paradox. At the very moment the world believed it was entering a new age, here was concrete evidence that the core ideas behind this new age were, in fact, centuries old. The timing made the discovery all the more electrifying. The schematics were not vague or symbolic. They were technical and practical. The detailed annotations, the precise measurements, the careful consideration of fuel, staging, and stability, it all pointed to a serious scientific endeavor. Professor Tadarishu's find was published in a Romanian historical journal in 1967, and the story began to slowly seep into the public consciousness, raising a host of difficult questions. Who was this mysterious 16th century genius, who had seemingly invented the multi-stage rocket 400 years before its time? Was this a well-known historical figure whose scientific work had been overlooked? Why had this knowledge been lost? If these concepts were documented in the 1500s, why did the world have to wait until the mid-20th century, until the work of pioneers like Robert Goddard, Hermann Oberth, and Werner von Braun to rediscover them? The manuscript was like a message in a bottle, a transmission from a forgotten branch of technological history. It suggested a timeline of scientific development that was not a smooth linear progression, but one with strange peaks, lost knowledge, and hidden chapters. The Cebu manuscript was a direct challenge to the established narrative of the scientific revolution and the history of technology. It placed the conceptual birth of spaceflight not in the age of radio and automobiles, but in the age of Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus. The fact that it was found in a miscellaneous collection, its significance unrecognized for centuries, only added to the mystery. It had been hiding in plain sight, a silent testament to a level of technical foresight that was, by all conventional historical accounts, simply impossible for its time. The initial shock of the discovery was the realization that the blueprints for the space race had not been written in the 20th century, but had been quietly waiting in a Romanian archive, penned by a hand that had been dust for over 400 years. The first step in unraveling this mystery was to identify that hand and understand the world in which such futuristic ideas could have been conceived. The discovery of the Sibiu manuscript and its shockingly advanced rocketry designs immediately begged the question: who was the mind behind this work? A document of such technical foresight could not have been the product of an idle dreamer or an armchair philosopher. It had to be the work of someone with a deep, practical understanding of engineering, ballistics, and the chemistry of explosives. The meticulous detail, the focus on practical application, and the military context all pointed to a professional. The investigation into the manuscript's authorship revealed a name, a man whose life and work provide the crucial context for these seemingly impossible designs: Konrad Haas. Konrad Haas was not a famous Renaissance scientist or a well-known philosopher. He was a practical man of war, a military engineer whose name had been largely lost to history until the rediscovery of his work. While his exact origins are debated, he was likely an Austrian or a Transylvanian Saxon, born around the year 1509. His professional career brought him to the heart of the tumultuous political and military landscape of 16th-century Eastern Europe. By 1551, he had risen to a position of significant authority, serving as the Zugwart or head of the arsenal for the Kingdom of Hungary and the Principality of Transylvania, stationed in the city of Sibiu, then Hermannstadt. This was not a ceremonial title. It was a position of immense practical responsibility. As the chief arsenal master, Haas was in charge of the kingdom's weapons, armor, ammunition, and siege engines. His job was to maintain, improve, and develop the tools of war for an empire under constant threat. To understand Konrad Haas and his work, one must understand the world he inhabited. The mid-16th century was a period of existential crisis for the Kingdom of Hungary and its surrounding territories. The dominant military power of the age was the formidable Ottoman Empire, which was relentlessly pushing its way into the heart of Europe. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was still a recent and traumatic memory, and the Ottoman armies, with their vast numbers and highly effective artillery, seemed unstoppable. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 had resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Hungarians, shattering their kingdom and opening the door for decades of conflict. Haas was living and working on the front line of this clash of civilizations. Sibiu was a fortified city, a critical defensive bastion against Ottoman expansion. The constant threat of siege and invasion was not an abstract political reality. It was a part of daily life. This high-stakes environment was the crucible in which Haas's ideas were forged. His work on rocketry was not a purely academic exercise or a flight of fancy. It was born from a pressing military need to develop a new and more effective weapon that could counter the numerical and tactical advantages of the Ottoman forces. The primary weapons of the day were cannons and early firearms like the arquebus. While cannons were devastating against fortifications, they were slow to reload, difficult to aim precisely at moving targets, and had a limited effective range against massed infantry in the field. Haas seems to have envisioned rockets as a potential solution to these problems. His manuscript frames his rocket designs within a military context. He refers to one of his main designs as a Fliegend Lance, or flying lance. This name itself is revealing. It suggests a weapon designed not for bombardment like a cannon, but as a long-range projectile weapon, a way to strike at an enemy from a distance far greater than any arrow or spear. He theorized about using his rockets to deliver incendiary payloads to set fire to enemy camps or supply wagons, or as a terrifying psychological weapon to break the morale of advancing troops. The multi-stage design in this context makes perfect military sense. A single-stage rocket had a limited range, but a second or third stage, igniting high in the air and already traveling at great speed, could dramatically extend the weapon's reach, allowing his forces to strike at the enemy's rear echelons, command structures, or supply lines, sowing chaos and confusion far behind the front lines. The entire project appears to have been driven by a practical, problem-solving mindset. Haas was an engineer tasked with defending his city and his kingdom, and he was exploring every technological avenue, no matter how unconventional, to gain an advantage. The Cebu manuscript is a record of this systematic, obsessive work, documented over a period of nearly 3 decades, from 1529 to 1556. The fact that he maintained this detailed journal for so long suggests a deep and abiding passion for the subject. This was not a fleeting idea but a lifelong project. The manuscript is not just a collection of final designs. It is a laboratory notebook. It shows his thought process, his experiments, his failures, and his evolving ideas. He meticulously records different recipes for gunpowder, noting their properties and performance. He sketches various nozzle designs, considering how to best direct the explosive force. He works through the geometry of stabilization fins, trying to find the most effective shape. This systematic, empirical approach observe, experiment, record, refine is the very hallmark of the scientific method. Haas was not just an engineer. He was an experimental scientist. The nature of the manuscript also suggests that this work may have been a private, perhaps even secret, project. While his work on cannons and conventional artillery was part of his official duties as arsenal master, the advanced rocketry sections might have been a personal obsession, something he worked on in his own time. The ideas were so far ahead of the curve that they may have been met with skepticism or ridicule by his superiors. Military establishments are often conservative, favoring proven technologies over radical, unproven concepts. Haas may have kept his most advanced rocket theories to himself and a small circle of trusted assistants, fearing his project would be deemed a waste of valuable resources. This would explain why his ideas were bound within a larger, more conventional treatise on artillery. It could have been a way of hiding his more speculative work within an officially sanctioned document. The manuscript, therefore, might be the only surviving record of a secret research and development program, a 16th-century skunk works, operating out of the Cebu arsenal. The man himself, Conrad Haas, emerges from the pages as a figure of immense talent and foresight. He was clearly well-educated, literate in German and likely Latin, and possessed a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and chemistry. His drawings are clear and precise, the work of a skilled draftsman. But above all, he was a visionary. At a time when the concept of flight was limited to birds and mythological creatures, Haas was thinking about controlled, guided, high-speed projectiles. He was grappling with the fundamental challenges of rocketry that would confound scientists for the next 400 years. How to achieve greater range through staging, how to maintain stability at high speeds, and how to create more powerful and reliable propulsion systems. In the final pages of his manuscript, Haas's work takes a turn that transcends the military context. After decades of designing weapons of war, he seems to have had a change of heart. In a final chapter, he wrote a strong condemnation of the military use of his inventions, stating his belief that war was a brutal and inhumane endeavor. He advised that his work should never be used for destructive purposes, writing, "But my advice is for more peace and no war, leaving the rifles under the roof so the bullet is not fired, the gunpowder is not burned or wet, so the prince keeps his money, the arsenal master his life." That is the advice Conrad Haas gives. It is a poignant and surprising conclusion from a man who had dedicated his life to the craft of warfare. It suggests a man who, in his old age, grew wary of the very technologies he had helped to create. Konrad Haas died in Cebu in 1576. It seems his most advanced ideas died with him, or at least faded into obscurity. His work was never widely published or disseminated. The manuscript remained a singular, isolated document, a repository of lost knowledge. It would take the rediscovery of his journal in the 20th century to resurrect his name and his legacy. Understanding Konrad Haas is the key to understanding the Cebu manuscript. He was not an occultist or an alchemist dabbling in mystical arts. He was a professional military engineer, a man of his time, driven by the pressing needs of his environment. Yet, he was also a man ahead of his time, a visionary who, in the firelit workshops of a 16th-century arsenal, quietly laid down the theoretical foundations for the space age. His work stands as a powerful testament to the idea that genius can arise in any era, and that the seeds of the future are often planted in the most unexpected corners of the past. To fully grasp the significance of the Cebu manuscript, one must move beyond the historical context and delve into the technical specifics of what Konrad Haas designed. It is here, in the detailed schematics and engineering notes, that the truly impossible nature of his work becomes clear. The manuscript is not a collection of vague, fantastical sketches. It is a serious technical document that describes, with startling precision, several key principles of rocketry that are considered cornerstones of modern astronautics. These concepts were so far ahead of their time that they would have to be independently rediscovered and re-engineered centuries later. An analytical breakdown of Haas's designs reveals a level of technological foresight that continues to baffle historians of science and technology. The single most revolutionary concept detailed in the manuscript is, without question, the multi-stage rocket. The fundamental problem of rocketry is what is known as the tyranny of the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, a principle not formally articulated until the work of Russian pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1903. In simple terms, the equation shows that to achieve high velocities, a rocket must carry a massive amount of fuel relative to its own structural mass. However, the rocket must also burn fuel to lift the weight of the fuel it has not yet burned. This creates a situation of diminishing returns. A single-stage rocket large enough to reach orbit would need to be composed of over 90% fuel, leaving very little mass for the structure, engines, and payload. It is an almost insurmountable engineering challenge. The elegant solution to this problem is staging. By building a rocket in multiple separate sections or stages that are discarded as their fuel is consumed, the rocket continuously sheds useless dead weight. The upper stages are no longer burdened with lifting the empty fuel tanks and heavy engines of the lower stages, allowing them to achieve far greater speeds and altitudes than any single-stage vehicle of the same size. This principle is the absolute foundation of all orbital and interplanetary spaceflight. Without staging, the journey to the moon would have been impossible. And yet, for 100 years before Tsiolkovsky, Konrad Haas laid out this exact principle on the pages of his manuscript. His drawings are unambiguous. He shows a primary launch vehicle, a large booster rocket, which he calls the first stage. Firmly attached to the top of this booster is a smaller secondary rocket. This second stage, in turn, is capped with a pointed payload section which could be considered a third stage. Haas's accompanying text describes the sequence of operation precisely. The first stage ignites, providing the initial thrust to lift the entire assembly. When its propellant is exhausted, it detaches and falls away. At that moment, the second stage motor ignites, now freed from the massive weight of the first stage, and accelerates the remaining payload to a higher velocity. This is not a vague notion. It is a clear functional description of a sequential multi-stage launch system. He even designed different configurations, including a parallel stage design where 3 rockets were bundled together, an arrangement strikingly similar to the booster configurations of modern rockets like the Delta IV Heavy or the Falcon Heavy. To find this core concept of astronautical engineering so clearly articulated in a 16th-century document is nothing short of breathtaking. It is the manuscript's most profound and challenging claim. Beyond the revolutionary concept of staging, Haas's work displays a remarkable sophistication in the fields of aerodynamics and propulsion. His designs show a clear understanding that a rocket needs to be stable in flight to be effective. While early firework-like rockets were notoriously erratic, often tumbling end over end, Haas dedicated significant effort to solving the problem of stabilization. His solution, as depicted in his most advanced drawings, was the use of large delta-shaped triangular fins at the base of the rocket. This is a critical detail. While simple rectangular fins had been used on arrows for centuries, the delta wing is a specific and highly efficient aerodynamic shape. Its large surface area and swept-back leading edge provide excellent stability and control, particularly at high speeds. It is the design of choice for modern supersonic aircraft like the Concorde, and for many guided missiles. The fact that Haas not only included fins but specifically chose a delta shape suggests either an incredibly intuitive grasp of aerodynamics or a process of rigorous trial and error experimentation. This design feature would not become commonplace until the mid-20th century, yet Haas was sketching it in the 1550s. His innovations in propulsion were equally forward-thinking. The standard fuel of the era was black powder, a simple mixture of potassium nitrate, saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Haas, however, was not content with the standard recipe. His manuscript contains extensive notes on propellant chemistry. He documented numerous experiments with different formulations, adjusting the ratios of the ingredients to achieve different burn rates and thrust characteristics. He understood that a rocket needed a slow, sustained burn rather than a single violent explosion like a cannon. He went even further, designing propellant charges in specific shapes. He sketched solid fuel grains with a hollow core, sometimes in the shape of a hexagon or other polygons. This is an advanced technique known today as propellant grain design. By creating a hollow core, the surface area of the burning propellant remains relatively constant as it is consumed, resulting in a much steadier and more predictable thrust. This is a subtle but crucial element of solid rocket motor design that is still in use today. Perhaps most astonishingly, Haas appears to have theorized about combining different types of fuel, a precursor to the concept of a hybrid rocket engine. A hybrid rocket uses a solid fuel with a liquid oxidizer. Haas described a design where a liquid substance, the exact composition is a matter of debate, but it may have been a form of distilled alcohol or brandy, would be introduced into the combustion chamber along with the solid gunpowder. He believed this would create what he termed a fiercer and more powerful thrust. While it's highly unlikely he could have built a working liquid fuel pump or injection system, the very idea of combining liquid and solid propellants to improve performance is another concept that would not be seriously explored until the 20th century by pioneers like Robert Goddard. It demonstrates a restless, inventive mind pushing far beyond the boundaries of his era's technology. The culmination of all these advanced concepts, staging, aerodynamics, and propulsion is found in what is arguably the manuscript's most intriguing and ambitious design. Towards the end of his work, after detailing his various military flying lances, Haas sketched a final payload stage that was clearly not a weapon. He described it as a Phlegon's houselane, flying little house. The drawing shows a small, conical cabin, large enough for a person, complete with what appear to be sealed portholes for observation. This design explicitly raises the possibility that the ultimate ambition of Konrad Haas's work may have extended beyond terrestrial warfare to the concept of manned flight. It is, in essence, a 16th-century design for a space capsule. Of course, it is crucial to temper this interpretation with caution. A manned flight using his technology would have been suicidal. The G-forces would have been immense, and there was no concept of a life support system or a safe re-entry and landing mechanism. It is more likely that the flying little house was a theoretical endpoint, a thought experiment about the ultimate potential of his technology, rather than a practical blueprint for a 16th-century astronaut. Nonetheless, the mere fact that he conceived of it is extraordinary. At a time when the heavens were considered the unchanging divine realm of God, here was an engineer daring to design a man-made vehicle to travel through it. It represents a conceptual leap of staggering proportions, a shift from rocketry as a weapon to rocketry as a vehicle for transportation and exploration. When viewed in its totality, the technology described in the Cebu manuscript represents a complete, integrated system of thought. Konrad Haas did not just invent one piece of the puzzle. He seems to have conceptualized the entire system. He understood that to achieve great range you needed staging. To make staging work, you needed more powerful and reliable fuel. To ensure the rocket flew straight, you needed sophisticated aerodynamic stabilization. And he documented it all with the meticulous care of a modern engineer. This is what makes the manuscript so compelling and so challenging to conventional history. It is not a single lucky guess. It is a coherent and systematic body of work that anticipates the key breakthroughs of modern rocketry by 4 full centuries. The technical details contained within its pages are a powerful argument that this was more than just a dream. It was a serious scientific investigation into the future of flight. The existence of the Cebu manuscript is an undisputed fact. The 450-page document, with its detailed schematics and technical notes by Konrad Haas, is a physical artifact that can be seen and studied. The forward-thinking nature of its designs, multi-stage launchers, delta-wing fins, and advanced propellant concepts is also clear upon examination. The presence of these ideas in a 16th-century text is a profound historical anomaly. However, the most critical and contentious question remains unanswered by the manuscript itself. Were any of these advanced rockets ever actually built and tested? The gulf between a brilliant design on paper and a functional physical machine is immense. This question marks the dividing line between two starkly different interpretations of Konrad Haas's legacy. Was he a forgotten Da Vinci of rocketry, a practical genius whose successful experiments were lost to history? Or was he a brilliant theorist, a man whose imagination far outstripped the practical capabilities of his era, leaving behind a legacy of fascinating but ultimately unrealized dreams? The mainstream historical view, and the one held by most academic historians of science and technology, leans heavily towards the latter interpretation. The dominant theory is that the Cebu manuscript represents a magnificent and incredibly detailed thought experiment. In this view, Konrad Haas was a brilliant engineer who, tasked with improving the weaponry of his time, allowed his mind to run far ahead of the available technology. He was solving problems on paper, engaging in a theoretical exercise to see how far he could push the concept of rocketry. This perspective does not diminish his genius. Rather, it frames him as a visionary theorist. The meticulous drawings and calculations were part of a design process, a way to explore the potential of an idea without necessarily building it. The primary evidence supporting this theory-only viewpoint is a profound lack of corroborating evidence. For a project of this scale and ambition, the construction and testing of a multi-stage rocket one would expect to find some form of physical or supporting documentary proof beyond Haas's own notebook. There is, to date, no definitive archaeological evidence. No remnants of a launch gantry, no fragments of a failed rocket casing, no specialized tools, and no discarded engine components have ever been excavated in or around Cebu that can be definitively linked to Haas's rocket project. While the chances of such evidence surviving for over 450 years are slim, its complete absence is significant. Furthermore, there are no independent, contemporary written accounts describing a rocket launch of this nature. In the 16th century, the launch of a large multi-stage vehicle would have been a spectacular and terrifying public event. It would have been audible and visible for miles. It seems highly probable that such a dramatic display would have been recorded by other chroniclers, city officials, diplomats, or even in private letters and diaries of the citizens of Cebu. Yet, the archives have so far yielded no such account. The only record we have is Haas's own. This silence from other sources is a powerful argument that the most advanced designs never left the drawing board. Skeptics argue that the material and manufacturing challenges would have been insurmountable in the 1550s. Crafting a lightweight yet durable rocket casing, manufacturing reliable ignition systems for the upper stages, and creating the precise chemical mixtures for the fuel on a large scale would have been extraordinarily difficult. It is more likely, they contend, that Haas recognized these limitations and confined his most ambitious work to the realm of theory, creating a blueprint for a future he knew he could not build. However, this skeptical view is challenged by a tantalizing piece of anecdotal evidence that suggests Haas's work was not purely theoretical. Within the manuscript and in the local folklore of Cebu, there are hints of a real-world test. Some interpretations of Haas's own writings have been used to support the claim that a public launch of one of his rockets did, in fact, take place in Cebu in the year 1555. The story suggests that the event was a great success, with the flying lance traveling a significant distance. This narrative transforms Haas from a theorist into a practitioner, a man who not only designed but also built and successfully flew his creation. If true, this would mean the first successful flight of a multi-stage rocket occurred not in the 20th century, but in the heart of 16th century Transylvania. This claim, however, exists in a historical gray area. It is compelling and dramatic, but it lacks the firm, unambiguous corroboration required for mainstream historical acceptance. The primary source for the launch story comes from interpretations of the manuscript itself, which are open to debate. There is no independent contemporary document that states, "Today, Conrad Haas launched his great rocket." As such, the 1555 Cebu launch remains more in the realm of historical legend than established fact. It is a powerful and evocative story, but one that currently cannot be definitively proven. It represents the hope that Haas's genius was not confined to paper, but it is a hope built on a fragile foundation of evidence. The historical community remains, for the most part, unconvinced, awaiting the discovery of a smoking gun, a definitive record that can elevate the story from folklore to fact. To further complicate the picture, it is important to understand that Conrad Haas was not working in a complete vacuum. While his designs were exceptionally advanced, the general idea of improving rocketry was in the air during the late Renaissance. The most notable parallel is the work of Johann Schmidlapp, a German fireworks maker and pyrotechnist from Nuremberg. Around the year 1590, roughly 35 years after Haas documented his own work, Schmidlapp is credited with inventing and publicly demonstrating a two-stage rocket. His invention, known as the step rocket, involved placing a smaller firework rocket on top of a larger one. The larger rocket would carry the smaller one to its apex, at which point the smaller one would ignite and fly higher. This was a significant improvement over single-stage fireworks and was used for celebratory displays. The work of Schmidlapp is important for two reasons. First, it proves that the concept of staging was being independently developed by others, suggesting it was a logical next step in the evolution of pyrotechnics. Second, it highlights just how advanced Haas's work truly was. Schmidlapp's invention was a two-stage firework, designed for entertainment. Haas, working decades earlier, designed a three-stage aerodynamically finned vehicle with advanced propulsion systems, conceived as a long-range weapon or even a vehicle for flight. Schmidlapp's work was a simple, incremental improvement. Haas's work was a radical, systemic leap in technological thinking. Furthermore, there is no evidence that Schmidlapp ever saw Haas's manuscript. It seems Haas's work had no direct influence on the subsequent development of rocketry. His knowledge was not passed down or built upon. It was, for all practical purposes, a lost legacy. The branch of rocketry that began with Schmidlap's fireworks evolved slowly over the next few centuries, but the advanced integrated system conceived by Haas simply vanished, only to be rediscovered when the rest of the world had finally caught up to his thinking. This leads to the ultimate assessment of the debate. On one side, we have the weight of academic skepticism, grounded in the lack of physical evidence and independent verification. On the other, we have the tantalizing but unproven legend of a real-world launch, supported by the sheer practicality and detailed nature of the designs themselves. Perhaps the most balanced view is one that finds a middle ground. It is plausible that Haas, as a practical engineer, did conduct experiments. He may have successfully built and tested smaller, single-stage versions of his rockets to test his fuel mixtures and fin designs. This would have been a logical part of the design process. The legend of the 1555 launch could be a real, but perhaps exaggerated memory of one of these smaller-scale tests. It is also plausible that he attempted to build his magnum opus, the three-stage rocket, and that the project ultimately failed due to the immense technical challenges. A failed, secretive project would leave little historical trace. In this scenario, the manuscript would be the final record of his ambitions, a document detailing what he had hoped to achieve. This interpretation allows for Haas to be both a practitioner and a theorist, a man who experimented up to the limits of his era's technology, and then used theory and design to explore what lay beyond those limits. Ultimately, whether the rockets of Konrad Haas ever flew, the Cebu manuscript itself has successfully completed a remarkable journey. It has traveled through more than 4 centuries of history, a time capsule of lost knowledge from the dawn of the modern era. It is a testament to the power of human ingenuity to transcend the limitations of its own time. The document proves that the core concepts of the space age, staging, aerodynamics, advanced propulsion, were not the exclusive domain of 20th century science. They were conceived and meticulously documented by a 16th century military engineer on the frontiers of a threatened kingdom. Whether Konrad Haas's rockets ever left the ground remains a mystery locked in the past. But his ideas, preserved on paper, have undeniably taken flight, challenging our understanding of our own history, and reminding us that the path of technological progress is not always a straight line. Whether Konrad Haas's rockets ever left the ground remains unknown. His manuscript, however, successfully traveled through time, a 400-year-old message suggesting that the dawn of the space age may have occurred far earlier than we ever believed. Thanks for exploring with Ancient Relics Keeper. Stay curious, question everything, and remember, the truth is often buried deeper than we think.